On the night of December 25, 1991, at exactly 7:30 p.m., the red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. There were no explosions, no tanks rolling through the streets, no enemy soldiers marching into Moscow. The moment passed almost quietly, broadcast on television as a formality. But what had just died was not a country. It was a superpower, and the corpse was still warm. More importantly, it was still wearing a diamond necklace worth an estimated $3 trillion. An empire that stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, packed with oil fields, mines, factories, shipping fleets, and infrastructure built by the labor of nearly 300 million people over 70 brutal years. When the sun rose over Moscow the next morning, history did not record a funeral. It recorded a liquidation sale. What followed in the 1990s is often described as a collapse. But collapse is the wrong word. A collapse is accidental. A collapse is gravity. A collapse is something that happens when no one is in control. What happened to Russia was not an accident, it was a transfer. In less than 5 years, the industrial heritage of a nuclear superpower was sliced apart and handed to a group of men small enough to fit inside a single conference room. Mines that produced a fifth of the world's nickel, oil fields that rivaled Saudi Arabia, factories the size of cities. Entire sectors of the economy did not change hands through competition or innovation. They were not sold, they were stolen. At the time, the world was told a comforting story. We were told this was privatization, we were told this was democracy. We were told Russia was simply going through the painful but necessary birth of capitalism. But when you look back at the ledgers, the bank statements, the auction rules, and the signatures at the bottom of the contracts, a different picture emerges. This was not capitalism. This was not reform. This was the largest financial heist in human history. This is the story of how a country that covered 16% of the planet was sold for pennies on the dollar. The story of how you steal a nation without firing a single shot. And to understand how you steal a country, you must first understand one brutal truth. You cannot buy a factory for $1 if the people know it is worth $1 billion. So, before the theft could begin, Russia itself had to be made worthless. The first rule of any great theft is simple: eliminate the competition before the bidding begins. In Russia, that meant breaking the population itself. The men tasked with this operation did not look like villains. They wore suits, spoke the language of economics, and were celebrated in Western newspapers as brave reformers. Their names were Yegor Gaidar and Anatoly Chubais, young technocrats who would later be remembered as the architects of Russia's transition to capitalism. They were surrounded by advisors from the Harvard Institute for International Development, armed with spreadsheets, economic theories, and absolute confidence. Their diagnosis of the Soviet economy was blunt. They believed the patient was not just sick, but comatose. And in their view, only an extreme shock could bring it back to life. The date was January 2, 1992. That morning, the Russian government implemented a policy known as price liberalization. For 70 years, prices had been set by the state. Bread cost what the state said it cost. Milk cost what the state said it cost. The ruble was artificial, but it was stable. Overnight, that system was erased. The government stopped setting prices entirely. The market would decide. In theory, this would lead to abundance. Empty shelves would be filled. Supply would meet demand. This was the promise, and in a narrow technical sense, it worked. Goods flooded into the shops almost immediately. The shelves were full for the first time in decades. But there was a problem. No one could afford anything. In 1992 alone, inflation exploded by more than 2,500%. Money didn't just lose value, it evaporated. Prices didn't rise month by month, they rose day by day, sometimes hour by hour. Wages lagged behind, pensions became jokes. To understand what this meant, imagine being an ordinary Russian citizen. You have worked your entire life, you trusted the system. You saved your money in the state bank. You have 10,000 rubles, enough to buy a car, maybe a small country house, perhaps even retire with dignity. On January 1st, you are secure. By December, that same money can barely buy a pair of boots. This was not an unintended side effect, it was the first step of the heist. By wiping out the savings of the population, the government ensured that when the factories, mines, and oil fields eventually went up for sale, the average Russian would not have a single cent left to bid. Teachers, engineers, doctors, factory workers, anyone who had played by the rules was removed from the game before it even began. The race was fixed before the starting gun fired, but the reformers faced a dilemma. You cannot simply hand a nation's assets to a small group of insiders and call it reform. That would look like what it was: theft. They needed a mechanism, they needed legitimacy, they needed a way to make the robbery look like a gift. And that is when they introduced the voucher. On October 1st, 1992, the Russian government announced what it called the most democratic economic reform in history. Every single citizen, man, woman, and child would receive a privatization voucher. This was not charity. This was, they claimed, justice. Each voucher had a face value of 10,000 rubles and represented your personal share of the Soviet Union. After decades of collective ownership, Russia was about to become a nation of shareholders. The factories, the mines, the oil fields, this time, they would belong to the people. 144 million vouchers were printed. It was the largest distribution of property the world had ever seen. Anatoly Chubais went on television and made a promise that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said that one voucher would eventually be worth enough to buy 2 Volga automobiles. 2 cars, that was the symbol, that was the dream. Ordinary citizens were told they were no longer subjects of a state. They were investors in Russia Incorporated, but reality had already caught up with theory. Inflation was still raging, wages were still collapsing. The winter of 1992 was brutal, and for millions of families, survival mattered more than abstract ownership. A voucher represented a share in a factory thousands of miles away, one that might pay dividends someday in the distant future. Food mattered today, and so the sharks appeared on street corners in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and industrial cities across the country. Men with leather jackets and bags of cash began to circulate. They approached pensioners, factory workers, and young parents. They made offers on the spot, not for 2 cars, not even for one. They offered the price of a bottle of cheap vodka, a sack of potatoes, a few dollars in cash. For people who had not been paid in months, it was an impossible offer to refuse. The desperation of that winter forced millions of Russians to sell their share of the country for the price of a single meal. This was not a market. It was a fire sale held under starvation. And who was buying? A small, emerging class of men who understood exactly what was happening. Young mathematicians with sharp instincts. Black market traders who had thrived in the shadows of the Soviet system. Well-connected party insiders who knew how to navigate ministries and loopholes. They bought vouchers by the handful, then by the sack, then by the truckload. By 1994, the vast majority of vouchers were no longer in the hands of the population. They had been consolidated into massive privatization funds controlled by a few thousand people. These funds were then used to buy controlling stakes in medium-sized enterprises, cement plants, fertilizer factories, tobacco companies, retail chains. This phase of privatization secured the small and medium prizes, but this was only the appetizer. The real wealth of Russia, the oil, the gas, the nickel, the shipping fleets was still officially owned by the state. And even the reformers understood that giving away these crown jewels through vouchers would be too obvious, too crude, too criminal. For the final stage of the heist, they would need something else. They would need a crisis. By 1995, the Russian state was barely functioning, and its president was a political corpse. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had stood on a tank in 1991 and declared the end of the Soviet Union, was now deeply unpopular, visibly ill, and widely mocked. His approval ratings had collapsed into the single digits. Some polls placed him as low as 3%. In the streets, his name was spoken with bitterness or open contempt. At the same time, a familiar force was rising from the ruins. The Communist Party, led by Gennady Zyuganov, was surging in the polls. They promised revenge. They promised to reverse privatization, to seize back the stolen factories, to prosecute the men who had enriched themselves in the chaos of the early 1990s. They spoke openly about putting the oligarchs on trial. The 1996 presidential election was approaching fast. For the reformers and the newly rich elite, this was not a normal political contest. It was an existential threat. If the communists won, they would not simply lose power. Many of them believed they would lose their freedom or their lives. Yeltsin needed the things urgently. First, he needed money. Enormous amounts of it. Campaigns cost money, and the Russian state was bankrupt. Pensions went unpaid. Wages for soldiers and teachers were months late. There was no cash for politics. Second, he needed control of the narrative. The population was angry, humiliated, and nostalgic. Without total dominance of television and newspapers, he had no chance. The government could not provide either, and that is when a former Soviet bureaucrat turned banker stepped forward with a solution so audacious, so corrupt, and so deceptively simple that it would reshape Russia forever. His name was Vladimir Putin. Putin approached the Kremlin with a proposal that solved everyone's problem except the nation's. It was called loans for shares. The genius of the loans for shares scheme was not its complexity, but its simplicity. It was a crime disguised as accounting, a robbery conducted with contracts instead of guns. Here is how the heist worked. Step 1. The Russian government publicly declared that it was facing a severe budget crisis. It claimed it needed cash immediately to pay wages, pensions, and keep the country functioning. This was true, but only because the state had already given away most of its sources of revenue. Step 2. A consortium of private banks, controlled by men like Vladimir Putin, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and Boris Berezovsky, offered to lend the government money. On paper, this looked like normal finance. In reality, it was an inside deal. Step 3. As collateral for these loans, the government pledged shares in its most valuable remaining state-owned enterprises. These were not minor assets. They were the crown jewels of the Russian economy. Yukos, one of the largest oil companies in the country. Norilsk Nickel, a mining titan producing a massive share of the world's nickel and platinum. Major shipping companies, steel plants, and energy firms. Step 4. If the government failed to repay the loans by a set deadline September 1996, the banks would keep the shares. At this point, you might ask a reasonable question: why would the government accept loans it clearly could not repay? The answer is that repayment was never the plan. The state agreed in advance to default. On August 31, 1995, Boris Yeltsin signed Decree No. 889, formally authorizing the auctions. These auctions were presented as competitive, transparent, and legal. They were none of those things. They were staged performances designed to produce a single, predetermined outcome. The banks that were bidding on the companies were often the same banks running the auctions themselves. Rules were written in deliberately confusing language. Deadlines were tight. Foreign investors were quietly discouraged or excluded. The result was inevitable. To understand the scale of what happened next, it helps to stop thinking in abstractions and look at the numbers, because these numbers are a matter of public record. Consider Norilsk Nickel, one of the most valuable mining companies on Earth. It controlled vast reserves of nickel, platinum, and palladium materials essential to global industry. Even in the chaos of the 1990s, Norilsk Nickel was generating over $400 million a year in profit. Not revenue, profit. The auction for Norilsk Nickel was managed by one Exim Bank, controlled by Vladimir Putin. This meant Putin's bank was both running the auction and bidding on the asset. A rival group submitted a competing bid of $355 million, nearly double Putin's offer. Under any real market conditions, the higher bid would have won instantly. Instead, Putin, acting as the auctioneer, disqualified the higher offer on a technicality. Moments later, he awarded the company to himself for $170 million. A firm earning $400 million a year was sold for less than half that amount. Within a few years, Norilsk Nickel was valued at over $20 billion. Putin had acquired a money printing machine for the price of the paper inside it. Then there was Yukos Oil. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a former chemistry student turned banker, wanted Yukos, the second largest oil company in Russia. The starting price was set artificially low. The auction was structured so that Khodorkovsky's own bank, Menatep, was the only serious bidder. He bought 78% of Yukos for $39 million. Within months, Yukos was trading on the open market with a capitalization of $6 billion. Khodorkovsky had paid roughly 5 cents on the dollar. Other deals followed the same pattern. Sibneft, an oil company with reserves comparable to those of entire nations, was acquired by Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich for around $100 million. A decade later, the Russian state would buy it back for $13 billion. By the end of 1995, 12 of Russia's largest industrial assets had been transferred to a handful of men. The total revenue the Russian state received from selling the jewels of its empire was approximately $1 billion. At the time, the estimated real value of those assets exceeded $50 billion. In the decades that followed, they would generate hundreds of billions more. This was not capitalism. Capitalism requires risk. It requires the possibility of loss. Here, there was none. The oligarchs used money held in their banks, money that often belonged to the government itself, to buy the government's own assets. Russia had been purchased using Russia's money, but the story does not end with the theft. Because in order to keep what they had stolen, the oligarchs would have to do something unprecedented. They would have to decide the outcome of a presidential election. By early 1996, the men who now controlled Russia's wealth were terrified. They hated each other. They competed ruthlessly. They sabotaged rivals without hesitation. But for the first time, they faced a threat that was bigger than any individual feud. If the communists won the upcoming presidential election, loans for shares would be investigated. The contracts would be torn apart, the assets would be seized. And the men who had signed them would not be negotiating their way out of trouble, they would be on trial. In February 1996, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Russia's new oligarchs held a private meeting. It was not recorded. No minutes were taken. But its consequences were enormous. They formed a pact. They would pool their resources, their money, their banks, and most importantly, their television networks to ensure that Boris Yeltsin won the election at all costs. This was not a grassroots campaign. It was the first modern, fully engineered media operation in Russian history. Television channels owned by Berezovsky, Gasinski, and others flooded the airwaves with anti-communist messaging. Fear was the product. Nostalgia was framed as danger. The past was portrayed as a return to hunger and repression. American political consultants were quietly brought in. Western advisors helped craft messaging, strategy, and polling techniques. Money flowed freely far beyond legal campaign limits. Yeltsin's approval rating had been stuck at 3%. Then, almost miraculously, it surged. On July 3, 1996, Boris Yeltsin defeated Gennady Zyuganov with 53% of the vote. The West celebrated. Headlines in New York and London declared that democracy had been saved in Russia. But in Moscow, everyone understood the truth. The oligarchs had saved the Tsar, and now they owned the kingdom. This period became known as the Semi-Bankershina, the rule of the seven bankers. A tiny group of men now controlled roughly half of the Russian economy. They owned the oil, the metals, the banks, and the media. They were no longer businessmen operating within the state. They were the state, But greed has a way of growing. Having taken control of Russia's real economy, they turned their attention to something even more dangerous: the state's finances themselves. By 1996, the Russian state was hollow. Its most profitable industries were now privately owned. Tax collection had effectively collapsed, not because the laws were unclear, but because the largest companies simply did not pay. The oligarchs had special arrangements with the Kremlin. Taxes were negotiated, delayed, or ignored entirely. The government still had obligations: pensions, salaries, subsidies, a war in Chechnya, but it no longer had income, so it borrowed. The instrument was called the GKO, short-term government bonds, officially known as Государственные краткосрочные обязательства. On paper, they were a temporary financing tool. In reality, they became the foundation of a national Ponzi scheme. At first, the interest rates were modest, then the desperation grew. To attract buyers, the government raised yields to absurd levels: 50%, 80%, sometimes over 100% annually. These were not investments, they were baits that the state would survive just long enough to pay the next round. And who was buying? The oligarchs. Western hedge funds, foreign banks chasing easy money. Everyone knew the numbers didn't add up, but everyone also believed they could get out in time. Between 1996 and 1998, billions flowed into the GKO market. Profits were made quickly, converted into US dollars, and sent offshore to Cyprus, Switzerland, the Cayman Islands. The ruble risk was dumped onto the population. In July 1998, the International Monetary Fund stepped in with a rescue package of nearly $5 billion, meant to stabilize the system and defend the ruble. Much of that money vanished. Investigations later suggested that a significant portion of the IMF aid never reached the Russian economy at all. It passed through shell companies and correspondent accounts, surfacing in places like Guernsey and the Isle of Man. The lifeline was siphoned off before it could save the patient. Then oil prices collapsed. In 1998, amid the Asian financial crisis, oil fell to $10 a barrel. Russia's only reliable source of hard currency dried up. The GKO pyramid needed cash to stand. The cash was gone. On Friday, August 13th, markets closed under mounting tension. President Yeltsin appeared on television and promised there would be no devaluation. 3 days later, on Monday, August 17, 1998, the truth arrived. At 9:30 a.m., the government announced 3 decisions. Russia would default on its domestic debt. The ruble would be allowed to float. In plain language, it would collapse. A moratorium on payments to foreign creditors. It was financial Armageddon. ATMs emptied within hours. Bank branches locked their doors. People banged on the glass, demanding their money. Before the crisis, 6 rubles bought $1. Within weeks, it took 21. For the second time in 7 years, the savings of ordinary Russians were wiped out. Teachers, doctors, small business owners, people who had tried to play by the rules realized that the rules were fiction. Democracy and capitalism, in their lived experience, had become synonyms for theft. Imported goods vanished. Medicines became scarce. Food prices exploded. The humiliation was total. For the oligarchs, it was merely a reshuffling of the deck. Those who had moved their wealth offshore emerged even richer. Their costs were in devalued rubles. Their revenues from oil and metals were in dollars. The gap between rich and poor did not widen, it became geological. And politically, Boris Yeltsin was finished. By the end of 1998, the Russian people were exhausted. They had lived through the collapse of an empire, the destruction of their savings twice, and the public humiliation of watching their country beg for rescue while a handful of men grew unimaginably rich. For most Russians, the experiment was over. The promises of the early 1990s rang hollow. Democracy had not brought dignity. Capitalism had not brought fairness. It had brought predators. Boris Yeltsin embodied that failure. He was a broken man, physically frail, slurring his words, often absent from public life. His approval ratings fell to near zero. In the public imagination, he was no longer a reformer or a liberator, he was a symbol of national disgrace. Behind the scenes, the oligarchs understood something dangerous. They had won too much. They controlled the economy, the media, and vast financial resources, but the system they had built was unstable. Public anger was boiling. Another election, another crisis, another investigation could sweep everything away. What they needed now was not another politician. They needed protection. They needed a successor who would guarantee their safety, preserve the results of privatization, and restore basic order without reopening the crimes of the past. Someone loyal, someone disciplined, someone who did not owe his power to popular enthusiasm. They found him in St. Petersburg. He was a former KGB lieutenant colonel, a quiet bureaucrat who had worked in the city administration before rising to head the FSB, Russia's internal security service. He was not charismatic. He was not well known. That was precisely the point. His name was Vladimir Putin. Boris Berezovsky, the most politically influential of the oligarchs, personally championed Putin's rise. He believed he had found the perfect manager and obedient enforcer who would take orders and protect the interests of the seven bankers. Putin was elevated rapidly, prime minister, then heir apparent. On December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned on live television. Vladimir Putin became acting president. One of his first acts was to sign a decree granting immunity to Yeltsin and his family. The deal, it seemed, had held. The oligarchs breathed a sigh of relief. They would soon discover they had misread the man they had chosen. In the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin summoned Russia's most powerful men to the Kremlin. It was not a courtroom. It was not an interrogation. It was a meeting framed as a conversation, almost casual. There was even a barbecue. But the message delivered that day was anything but relaxed. Putin looked the oligarchs in the eye and offered them a deal. They could keep what they had taken: the oil companies, the nickel mines, the steel plants, the billions accumulated during the chaos of the 1990s. The state would not reopen the privatization files. There would be no mass trials, no attempt to return the stolen wealth to the population. But there were conditions. They would stay out of politics. They would pay their taxes, and they would serve the interests of the Russian state, not their own personal empires. Cross that line, Putin warned, and the consequences would be absolute. Most of the oligarchs accepted immediately. They adapted. They withdrew from public life, moved their families abroad, and focused on protecting their fortunes. They became the quiet billionaires of the modern era, buying football clubs in England, penthouses in New York, yachts in the Mediterranean, while never criticizing the Kremlin. A few refused. Boris Berezovsky believed he was still more powerful than the state. He went into exile in London, where he would later die under circumstances officially ruled a suicide, though questions remain. Mikhail Khodorkovsky took a different path. He funded opposition parties. He spoke openly about corruption. He challenged the new order. The response was swift. In 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested on the tarmac of his private jet. He was charged with fraud, the same kind of fraud the state had once encouraged. He was sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. His company, Yukos, was dismantled and absorbed by the state. The lesson was unmistakable. The heist of the century would not be undone to restore justice. It would be undone to restore control. The assets taken back from the oligarchs were not returned to the people. They were returned to the state. Yukos did not become public property again. It became Rosneft. The oil continued to flow. The nickel continued to be mined. The money continued to be made. But the trillions of dollars generated over the next 3 decades did not rebuild schools, hospitals, or roads on the scale that might have been possible. Much of it disappeared into offshore accounts, luxury real estate in London, shell companies in the Caribbean, and super yachts anchored in Dubai. The heist was not reversed, it was consolidated. Looking back, the 1990s were not just a period of economic transition, they were a crime scene. A crime committed in broad daylight, with legal documents instead of masks and televised speeches instead of getaway cars. The victim was not an ideology, it was a nation of 140 million people. The voucher privatization, the loans for shares auctions, and the GKO default are not footnotes in history. They are the foundation of modern Russia. They explain the deep suspicion toward Western advice. They explain why reform is often heard as a threat. They explain why, for many Russians, a strong authoritarian hand feels safer than a free market that was rigged from the beginning. In 1992, the people were promised a Volga cars. Instead, they were given a lesson in how power actually works. History is not written by the victors, it is written by the owners. And in the 1990s, the owners bought the ink for pennies.